Welcome to this presentation of the Civitas poll from the John Locke Foundation. My name is Mitch Kokai. I'm Senior Political Analyst at the Locke Foundation and joined for expert analysis this time by Nick Oxner, who is the Chief Investigative Reporter at WBTV. If you want to follow him on Twitter, it's really easy at Nick Oxner, WBTV.
The hard part spelling Oxner.
That's right. That's right. Let me see if I can get it right. OCHSNER. And Nick with a K, N-I-C-K, so Nick Oxner, WBTV, that is the Twitter handle. You are also co-author of a book called The Vote Collectors, and before we get into the Civitas poll, give us your 30-second elevator speech on the vote collectors.
Shenanigans. It's about shenanigans, and shenanigans in the 2018 9th Congressional District race, and traces how we got to that point in the history of race and politics in southeastern North Carolina. I promise, as my wife always says, it's much more interesting than I just made it sound.
So the book is titled The Vote Collectors. People can find it anywhere they
books are sold, yes.
Very good. All right, well, let's go ahead now and then turn to the latest Civitas poll from the John Locke Foundation. And this was conducted for the John Locke Foundation by the polling company Signal. It was a survey taken from April 14th through the 16th and then again on the 18th. So no polling on Easter Sunday. It was nice that they took a break for that purpose. 600 people were polled. The margin of error plus or minus 3.95%. I can also tell you this survey was weighted to a likely general election voter universe. Known registered voters were interviewed by live phones and also SMS. So let's go ahead and go to the first item on the agenda, and that is whether people think that North Carolina, or the U.S. as a whole actually, is moving in the right direction or on the wrong track. And we see that in the latest version of this poll, 65% say we're on the wrong track, 27% in the right direction. If we look back a little over a year ago, March of 2021, North Carolina voters still thought we were on the wrong track, but that was about a plus 10 at that point. Now it's plus 38. Your thoughts?
There is nothing surprising about this, right? I mean, just generally the mood and the climate. I guess if I'm surprised at anything, it's the amount of credit with the three groups noted here on the slides, Democrats, liberals, and African Americans, that are still giving credit, think the U.S. is on the right track. Because we know everybody's being impacted just as equally across this country at the moment. So that's, if anything, surprising here. That's that.
Yeah, and if you see that 58% of Democrats, 60% of self-described liberals think we're on the right track, look at the other side. Republicans and conservatives, almost unanimous support that we're moving on the wrong track. 94% of Republicans, 92% of conservatives. So Republicans even more so than conservatives think we're moving in the wrong direction. But as you said, probably not a surprise given what we've seen. If you look at the trends, perhaps the good news for people looking at wrong track is that for the first time since June, that number of thinking that we're incredibly on the wrong track is down below 50%. But if you add the two together, certainly still bad news for anyone who is going to be held accountable for whether we're moving in the right direction or wrong track.
Yeah, and you see the dip, too, also in mostly wrong tracks. It's just down just a smidge. I mean, it's
down below 50%.
It's probably a function of there's not much, lower that you could, you couldn't grow that much more just functionally, I would imagine.
All right, let's go ahead and move into the one sort of election-related set of poll questions we had, and that was the generic ballot. This is, for those who haven't followed it very closely, this is when you look at not any candidates that anyone knows of, but just saying if you had to vote for a party, vote for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, how would you vote in the election? That's not how we vote, but it does give people a sense of where people are leaning. And if you look at the legislative ballot right now, 51% say they would support the Republican candidate, 41% the Democratic candidate. That's a positive sign for Republicans.
What I want to know is who are the 2% of people who identify themselves as Republican who are supporting the Democratic candidate? This has got to make you feel good if you are, running the House or Senate Republican caucuses, right? I mean, and it's a test, I guess, of at least the Republican messaging in this state because they've been in charge for a long time. And having a party that's been in charge for this long, you would think more people, frankly, be angry. Just generically would want to get rid of them. And yet here they are still maintaining that lead in a generic ballot poll.
Looking at some of the subgroups, one of the things that interested me is it's very tight when you look at younger voters, those under 35, and older voters, 65 plus, where you see the most advantage for Republicans, 35 to 64. Both of those groups had very substantial margins, including a 21-point edge among those from 35 to 49. That's interesting. Younger and older voters sort of mixed. Those in the kind of prime working years, 35 to 64, definitely saying Republican.
Yeah, well, and what I'm more interested in here is looking at 404 voters down at the very end of the slide, highlighted in orange there. Look how tight that is. So if you're almost evenly split amongst the people who are always voting, I'm a bigger takeaway is that 18 to 34 is actually evenly split here between Republicans and Democrats. I'd frankly expect that to be weighted more towards Democrats. So when I look at those, that surprises me a bit more than the 35 to 49 or 50 to 64.
Yeah, and another interesting piece before we move on, always you have to look at the unaffiliated voters, especially since they now have the largest number of people, more so than Democrats or Republicans, and they're 52-33. That's if you're a Republican, you have to be smiling at that.
That's exactly right, and that's the messaging piece, right? I mean, that's where you feel like whose message is penetrating average voters right now, and that to me says that the Republicans are doing a better job of getting their message out and reaching those unaffiliated voters. So again, you got to feel pretty good if you're running a Republican legislative effort.
And we'll look very quickly at the trend line there, and you see that you can tell that number for the Republicans is going up and has been going up. It isn't all that long ago when you could look back and see that generic ballot was pretty well even.
Yeah.
So good sign.
Yeah.
Let's now move to a similar question, but this is for Congress. The congressional generic ballot, once again, very similar. Republicans making some slight gains. Now it's 52% saying they would support the Republican candidate, 40% the Democratic candidate. We don't vote for generic Democrats and Republicans, and in fact, if anyone has been following redistricting, these districts are mostly drawn so that one party or the other is likely to win. But still, this is kind of an interesting finding.
Yeah, I agree with that. And this year we might maybe vote more for a generic person because more people are going to have new representatives because of the redistricting effort, right? And so you might be more inclined to just pull the lever for whoever has the R or D next to your name. And so I think this is actually, more of a roadmap than what it might normally be.
And if you look within sort of those subgroups, once again, unaffiliateds, very substantial majority for Republicans, 51-32. Also, an interesting split between men and women. If you look at the women, they're slightly favoring the Republican candidate, 48-45. Men, substantially, 57-34.
Forget about it.
Yeah, tough for the Democrats on that charge. How does a candidate running in a real district take this information into account, do you think?
Well, I think it means that you've got, if I'm looking at this poll across the way and I'm a consultant, I'm targeting college-educated females because that's where I know it's up for grabs. Look at that split, too, between the college-educated voters, right? It's almost even 46-47. You look at females, 48-45. So if I'm looking for a place that might be some ground, right? I'm not going to target men because they're done. No college, again, done. They've made up their mind. But there's clear the college-educated female. There's some room there to make some inroads, and that looks like that could be the battleground.
That's why we bring you in for the expert analysis. Once again, we're chatting with Nick Ochsner, who is the chief investigative reporter at WBTV. Very quickly, we'll show you the trend. Very similar to what we saw on the legislative ballot. Once again, slight increases over the past few months for the Republicans. But now let's move to sort of the one of the common things that we talk about, job approval for our top executives. Let's look at the president, President Joe Biden's job approval. If you're wondering about the headlines that go with these slides, I don't write them. Our pollster actually writes them. So if you follow this. Biden's job approval has fallen significantly. I would agree with that, but I'm not the one who came up with that. Signal came up with that. And if you look at those numbers right now, approval for the president, 36%, disapproval, 56%. Back in March 2021, a little bit more than a year ago, people were basically split. Right now, he's well underwater.
I mean, and this mirrors what we've seen in national polling in recent times. There's nothing surprising about this. It might be worrying. I mean, and we've seen Democrats talk about this when Barack Obama was at the White House a week or two ago, right? He addressed it and said, you know, we as Democrats have to get our message out more. The polls like these are what have people like Barack Obama saying we got to do more to get our message out, and hopefully try to get this graph moving in the other direction.
Is that the same meeting where he didn't seem to be paying much attention to President Biden? I'll make that my editorial comment, not yours. But if we look within the subgroups once again, another interesting thing to me was the breakdown by age. The best place that President Biden does is with the older voters, 65 plus. Still, disapproval wins out, but only by 5 points. If you look at the youngest folks, 30% approval if you're under 35, 29% approval from 35 to 49. Younger voters are just not buying what Biden's selling.
Which is a real problem, if you're right, because traditionally you would expect at least the 18 to 34 bracket to be leaning or happy with the, you know, Democrat, just on a generic Democrat ballot. But again, it underscores just the depths that Biden's approval has sunk to when you've lost every age category. You know, and how do we get these folks back if you're him, right? It's probably because you've alienated the young people in your own party, you've alienated the young Republicans and young swing voters, and how do you even start to build? Where's your base to build from? I mean, you know, 30% of 18 to 34, 29% of 35 to 49, that is not a big base to build off of.
That is not, and I will say just on behalf of the president, because it's not in the slides here, the one good piece of news is that while his approval rating went down a couple of points since the last time we took this poll, the disapproval also went down by a couple of points. So a few more people are unsure. They've decided, I'm not going to take a stance at this point. So not good news, but at least there's one little nugget of not bad news. Let's go ahead and look very briefly at the trend line. Once again, you see that while the disapproval and serious disapproval has basically stayed pretty steady, the generally approving has gone way down, kind of hit a low point and is basically plateaued now.
Yeah, again, I think that's, again, a function of you can't get much lower. I mean, you could theoretically, but you're not going to.
Right. There are some people, I think, who are going to say, whether they believe it or not, that they approve of his job performance. All right. Now, before we move on to the next slide, I should remind folks that if you have questions for us, you can submit them to us if you're watching on the Facebook page, facebook.com/John Locke Foundation. I'm monitoring that on this computer, and we'll take your questions if you have any questions for us if we have time at the end of the presentation. I suspect that we will. But now let's move on from President Biden's job approval to Governor Roy Cooper's job approval, and this is better news.
I would say great news if you're Roy Cooper, quite frankly.
Roy Cooper at 46% approval, 42% disapproval. We don't have it on the slide, but that actually does mark a reversal of being above board or underwater. The last time we took this poll, he was about 3 points underwater. Now back 4 points ahead.
Look, this is not surprising as someone who covers Cooper intensely, right? We know that he's got a strong base in North Carolina. He's got a good and disciplined messaging operation, both in his gubernatorial office and from the campaign side. Even when, you know, he had issues with hurricane recovery or with DOT or with the DMV, they never quite seemed to penetrate and move the needle on Cooper himself. This is a testament to the governor, to Morgan Jackson, to his aides around him. But, you know, if I am Joe Biden or anyone in Joe Biden's orbit, I'm calling the good folks in North Carolina to see. And this is why you hear Cooper talked about, you know, as a potential national player in future, you know, vice president. You know, we've heard the rumors for several years now. Could he get a VP look in the future? This is why. Look at he's a, you know, a Democratic governor of a southern state who continues to maintain approval numbers that are strong, even as legislative Democrats way underwater, congressional Democrats way underwater, Joe Biden way underwater in North Carolina. Roy Cooper on top here.
You mentioned the thought about him being a potential vice presidential candidate. We've even seen the Washington Post report him as a potential presidential contender. Maybe 6 or 7 on the list.
Why would you not?
Yeah, I mean, if you didn't know anything about him, you would just say, Southern governor, Democrat, his one re-election, seems to be doing well in the polls. Why not?
Yeah.
And if we look at the specific numbers, some of the things that interested me, once again, the gender gap. I mean, you look at the approval among women, 15 points ahead, where he's 9 points underwater with men.
But only 9. I mean, compare that again, right? That's
exactly,
not bad.
Exactly. Not as bad, and certainly doesn't bring him down to being below the 50% mark. And then, among the groups that see most popularity and most job approval, people 65 and older, and I'm wondering how much of that has to do with the way that he's approached COVID. A lot of people have been concerned about the lockdowns and the emergency order extending. Maybe it's older voters saying, look, he's been protecting us, he's been looking out for us.
Yeah, well, you have that, and remember, this was the least unfavorable group for Biden too, right? And so I also wonder if these are the folks who are the least impacted by what we're feeling in the economy right now. They're not out trying to buy their first or second homes. They're not raising a family. They're not, maybe traveling to and from work as much. And so you're not impacted as much by high gas prices, by the housing market just being nuts, all those factors as well.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. I'm certain that the Cooper team and the people who want to emulate Cooper are looking at these numbers very closely.
I would be.
Figure out where they go.
Yeah.
Once again, looking at the trend line, won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but you can see that since the last time we polled on this in January, some of these numbers that are good for Cooper going a little bit back up.
Yeah, and the ones that are bad are going a little down.
Yeah, so
but look at that we'll call that a Carolina blue line, I think, right?
Yeah.
That's where it's folks going, yeah, it's fine, it's not bad.
Somewhat approved.
Yeah,
somewhat approved.
Yeah, and then even look at the neither approve nor disapprove, right? Also, like that's fine. We're very ambivalent.
In some cases, I would suspect that a lot of people look at Governor Roy Cooper and say, hey, he's not doing anything that makes us dislike him.
Yeah.
Whether you like him or not, he's not really doing anything that makes you mad. Now, Republicans will disagree, of course, but they're not his target audience. His audience is not just Democrats, but people who could vote either way.
Yeah, and all those unaffiliated that we already talked about.
Exactly. All right, let's go ahead and move beyond now the political issues and get back into some issues of importance to people. We put 10 potential issues out there in front of the voters in this Civitas poll and said, which is the most important one to you? Pocketbook issues turn out to be the top. Inflation, number 1 at 18%. Number 3 was jobs in the economy at 13%. Put those two together, almost a third of the people said economic issues. And then sandwiched in between them at number 2, 14% with election integrity.
As someone who wrote a book about election integrity, I was heartened to hear this. By the book. That being said, it doesn't really jive, right? It doesn't even, taxes and government spending here at number 4. Healthcare, those also really get into pocketbook issues too, right? Because it's all affecting your money. And so how we have election integrity so high there, I don't know. Interesting. I'm surprised education is so far down the list. I'm surprised law and order is so far down the list, quite frankly.
And among folks who follow Republican politics very closely, immigration, very low on the list.
Right.
They're number 8 at about 6.5%. If you're looking at some of the subgroups, inflation, I was interested to see that inflation was a substantial leader among women more than men. Among men, it was an almost even split among inflation, election integrity, jobs in the economy, all 50%. Women, I guess it's because they're the ones who actually know how much things cost and how much it affects
running the household.
Affects the household.
Yes, absolutely. And look, this just is a reminder of what our current economic situation and specifically inflation has done to upend the political order. If we didn't have this massive inflation issue that we're dealing with right now, imagine what Biden's approval numbers would look like. Imagine what your generic ballot would look like. And this is certainly the elephant in the room and mostly it's the thing weighing down on you if you're a Democrat.
Yeah, certainly interesting. Unaffiliateds, once again, you see that inflation is particularly important to them, and election integrity, much less of a factor for them, down to only 8% as their top issue. They would put the taxes and government spending, jobs in the economy, way above election integrity, also putting the issues of energy and the environment and education up there. So election integrity, important to politicos, people who are affiliated with the parties. If you're unaffiliated, not as big an issue.
Well, and that's not surprising, right? How you live your life are the things that people care about if you're not caring about politics.
Exactly, exactly. Well, very interesting. So we will be following that very closely. Let's move on now to whether people think the economy is getting better or not. 20% say the economy is getting better. 66% say it's getting worse. No one who's in any charge of any government unit can be happy when 2/3 of the people say the economy is getting worse.
I want to talk to the 1/3 who thinks it's getting better and ask what they.
20%.
You know, who just, well, that's fair because we have some about the same. Okay, I want to talk to the third that think it's not getting worse and find out why they think, you know, it's fascinating. And again, we look at all the other slides that we've already talked about. Clearly, that's the prevailing sentiment. And it's going to continue to be the prevailing sentiment until things change.
And if you look at those who think it's getting better, not surprising, those who like the current regime, we see among Democrats 41% to 40% getting better, and among liberals 43% to 33%. So only if you're looking for that third who don't think things are, it's the liberals, the 33% who think things are good.
Which is interesting, though. So if I'm a Republican lawmaker, and I frequently like to tout how great my economic policies are because I've cut taxes and we've made a business-friendly climate, which all those things that they like to talk about. Well, that's also economic issues. So you can't say, look at me, I'm responsible for the economy, when a lot of people think the economy is getting worse.
Yeah, and our next slide, I think, is going to get into another interesting issue for those who are in charge of the federal government. Let's go ahead and get to that slide. The Biden administration and its impact on the economy. 54% believe that the Biden administration's policies have hurt the economy. 31% say it's improved. And the reason I was sort of teeing this up is because the Biden administration could point to a number of economic indicators and say, hey, these are good. We're creating jobs. Unemployment is down. People aren't really focusing on that.
It's all about perception, right? Most all politics is about perception. And if Trump were in office right now, they would think Trump has hurt the economy. If under the exact same circumstances, if E.T. was in office right now, they'd blame E.T. for the. It's
they
really
tell him to go home.
Yeah. But it's really just about I'm feeling bad right now because I'm paying more at the gas pump, I'm paying more at the grocery store, I can't find a new car, my washing machine's out, and it's going to take 3 weeks to get a replacement belt in. Even though you're right. Jobs, higher wages, those are all happening and actually contributing to inflation. And so whoever's at the very top is going to get that blame.
And this is an interesting question to ask you, given that you're a millennial.
I am.
Yeah, so I am just old enough to remember when inflation was really bad as a kid, not as an adult. So you'd really have to be probably in late 50s, early 60s to remember how it impacted you as a new person working in the economy. So for folks of your age, this is the first time inflation has even really been an issue, and I only distantly remember it as a kid. This has to be something, since it's so new as an issue, that it probably has even more of an impact than something that crops up every once in a while that we're all used to.
Yeah, I think it's, and on behalf of all millennials, we like to complain about what a bad shake we've had, right? So when we're in college and graduating college, the economic downturn of 2008 to 2012, we're trying to find a job. Then the housing market's been terrible, student loan debt. So this is just the next flavor of bad economic news that we've had to deal with. I actually think it's like a hard concept to, even for myself, inflation's bad, generally speaking, means we're paying more. But I don't know that we hear that and equate that to what exactly does that mean. Does that make sense? Other than I think we're going to get a hard lesson in it, means interest rates are going to go up, right? To try to control inflation. We're not used to that. If anything over 6%, I'm going to, I don't know what to do. And so I think that's, as a millennial, just the next thing in a long line of things we've had to deal with.
It's very interesting because we've seen inflation levels like this for the first time since the early 80s. And as you just alluded to, the way that that was handled was to allow interest rates to go up and to go ahead and accept the fact that there was going to be a recession. I don't think anyone wants the R word this time around. But if interest rates go up substantially, you can almost guarantee something like that.
Arguably, we're in the recession because interest rates have been at historic lows, which propped the economy up, so it'll be fun to see. I'm glad I bought a house a year and a half ago.
Your timing was excellent. All right, let's move on to another issue involving the Biden administration. And this one, a little bit different. The Biden administration's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 40% approval, 45% disapproval. Not as bad as in general for Biden, and not as bad as on the economy.
No, but still, I would have expected the approval to be on top here. I think I don't actually know what to explain. What could explain this, quite frankly, other than I'm looking at the disapprovals here, strong disapprovals with men. I think we know that from all these other numbers, men polled in this survey, generally speaking, we're going to disapprove of just about anything with Joe Biden or a Democrat. Right. But it still is kind of I would have expected these numbers to be higher in the approval.
Yeah, and the unaffiliated basically mirrors what we've seen with the voter groups in general. Interesting split between men and women. Women actually just within the margin of error, but slightly approving of his handling of the invasion, 44% to 43%, whereas men, 11 points underwater for him there. So very interesting that the Biden administration has seen only a 40% approval of the handling of the Russian invasion, but better than he's doing on some other things, including the economy. All right, we're going to move on now to something that has been in the news, and that is the issue of felons voting in our elections. Anything about that in vote collectors? I think some of the people in vote collectors may have become felons.
And Alan McCrae Dallas is a convicted felon.
Okay. So, but we had a couple of questions on this in the poll. The first one was the provision in the state constitution, which says that felons cannot vote until they have complied with all of the requirements set by law. So basically, if you're a felon, you can't vote unless a law is passed that tells you how you can. In fact, I believe the question had the actual language from the Constitution or something very close to it said, do you agree or disagree with this? 66% agreement, 23% disagreement. So people kind of like what the Constitution says about felons voting.
That is not surprising, I don't think, especially when we saw the election integrity graph from a couple slides ago. I think those issues go hand in hand.
Yeah, and the only group that where it was even close, liberals, self-described liberals, 46% agreed, but 42% disagreement. So almost split, but still general support for the provision in the state constitution. Now, moving on to the next slide, the reason that we talked about this is because of a recent court ruling. We saw back in 2021 that a 3-judge panel out of Wake County ruled 2-1 that felons should not be blocked by this law that was written back in 1973 to implement the constitutional provision. And so they said, we don't have a fully formed opinion yet, but we're throwing this law out, and felons who have completed active prison time should be able to vote. State Court of Appeals stepped in, blocked it at that time. State Supreme Court didn't do anything about it. Now, 8 months later, basically, that same 3-judge panel came out, still ruling 2-1 that we want to allow felons who've completed their active prison time to vote. And they came up with a much more substantial opinion this time. Once again, the Court of Appeals stepped in and stopped it. But we asked what voters thought about this idea that people should, the court ruling saying that people should be able to vote if they have completed the active prison time but haven't finished the parole, probation, or post-release supervision. And we found 38% approval, 54% disapproval.
I would have been more interested in seeing a question about, did you even know this had happened?
I think there's another slide later that I think would have mirrored this very much, where it would be like 2 or 3% said yes and 90% said no. But yes, your thoughts about that?
You know, it's interesting to me actually that more Republicans didn't approve, because we've seen this bipartisan effort both in the North Carolina General Assembly and in the Congress at criminal justice reform. And so to hear that this particular prong of criminal justice reform, we could say, breaks down so much more partisan is interesting, because on generally across the board matters of criminal justice reform, we've seen some pretty bipartisan agreement in recent years.
There has been a lot of bipartisan agreement. I also noted within the groups here that the group that seemed to be very supportive of what happened was young people.
Yeah.
People under 35, 50% of them approved of that court ruling versus only 41% disapproval. Maybe this shows that younger people are more forgiving of people who have had some sort of felony that's put them in prison.
Absolutely, or just, you know, norms are changing every day.
Meanwhile, unaffiliateds, the people who are courted in every election, way against this, 59% versus 31% approval, more than the general population.
Again, very shocking to me.
Yeah. So, okay, let's go ahead now and move to another thing that might shock you, and that is whether people believe the 2022 elections are going to be free and fair. 48% yes, 37% no. I'm glad to see more yes than no, but I think we all have to be disappointed that the yes is less than 50%.
Well, we continue talking about 2020, right? A leader of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, continues to say the election was stolen in 2020. So it's, you know, no wonder then that you've got 33% of Republicans saying yes and 50% saying no. That doesn't surprise me. It's unfortunate. You know, I'm actually intrigued that the breakdown from unaffiliated breaks down almost with the survey results overall. Yeah. Interesting to me. Hopefully we can get that number much higher.
Exactly. That's something that election integrity, people can read the vote collectors to find out how they can make elections more secure. The age breakdown, once again, strikes me as interesting. Among the youngest voters, 18 to 34, most of them, or more of them than not, said they think they will be free and fair, but a substantial percentage have concerns. It's 44-41. And then if you look at this group from 50 to 64, for some reason, they don't think it's going to be free and fair.
And again, I don't know what to make of that, other than I think we need to be mindful in North Carolina of the message that we send when we go back and forth to court, which we've done for decades. That is a long time-honored North Carolina tradition around redistricting. My guess would be all the redistricting headlines of the last 6 to 8 months probably has some factor into this.
Probably the voter ID cases too.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And so that is an impact of that, right? Is especially as you go on and all the sides say, if we don't win if we don't win, things are going to be terrible. And both sides say that. And then someone's going to lose. So
it's going to be the worst thing ever.
Yes, yes. And so it's terrible for some group.
Yes. Interesting. All right, well, let's go ahead and move on. And I think you and I would both agree, and we hope most other people would agree, that we'd like to see that number well north of 50%.
Yes. Yes.
Right, let's go to the next slide. This is about voter ID, something that we just alluded to it. This has been on North Carolinians' minds for a long time. We had an election reform law that was passed in 2013 that had voter ID. We ended up using it for one election, one primary, and then it was thrown out by the Federal Court of Appeals. Voters went to the polls in 2018, passed a constitutional amendment for voter ID. The General Assembly passed a law to implement that amendment within weeks after the vote. We've not had voter ID since then because there are a series of court cases challenging it. So we just asked people, do you think people should have a photo ID when they go in person to vote? 68% said yes, 24% no.
This isn't surprising. Voter ID has long been popular with the public and with surveys. Here it's, again, popular still, and this is not a change, in my opinion.
Certainly not. And then you could look at the breakdown of the groups. I chuckled when I saw that 99% of Republicans. You can't get much more.
Who's the 1%? This is
right.
again. I want to know who's
right.
the 1%.
99% of Republicans, 97% of conservatives saying that they agree. Whereas if you flip the switch, liberals 63% against voter ID. Also among Democrats, 49%. So certainly a lot of Democrats then like voter ID, but the most liberal ones do not.
Well, but again, let's hone in on the most important group here, the unaffiliated. And you're at 68% of unaffiliated support voter ID. And so again, when we strip away people who aren't necessarily ideological, they support this too. And so it's again another bellwether, in my opinion.
And, you know, one of the things that has been an argument consistently against voter ID is that however you do it, it's going to impact African Americans in a negative way. But if you look at the polling, 53% of black voters say they support voter ID versus 31% against. 22 points in favor of it. Quite a few, though, also not having an opinion on that. If you have 53% approval, 31% disagreement. But that's something interesting to keep in mind. If it's designed to help African Americans, you would think that there would be a higher percentage of African Americans who wouldn't like it. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on. Gas prices have been up. We know that. So we asked people if they had been driving any less because of higher prices, or if their driving is about the same. You know, we also asked, are you driving more than normal? And apparently 2% of people think that they are driving normal or saying that.
They must own electric vehicles. We'll get to that in a
There
second.
you go. 56% less than normal, 41% no impact. Your thoughts on that?
I'm actually surprised the no impact is higher. That's the standout to me. I'm not shocked that at the 55% who are driving less than normal. But actually, I am heartened. If I'm, sitting here in the Biden camp, I'm heartened to see only 55%, and I love that 40% number, because that means that those are people who, we can start to recover. Gas is below $4 a gallon again for regular unleaded. So this is actually not terrible news if I'm looking at it from that way.
And my guess is some people who are unhappy about it said no impact because they didn't really have a choice. There's some people who, you got to drive to work. You got to take your kids to whatever thing they're doing. So maybe they've scaled back, but a lot of people just biting the bullet.
That's true too.
Cut elsewhere. Very interesting if you look at the folks who are most likely to say that it has not impacted them. Once again, Democrats and liberals. 54% of Democrats, 56% of liberals. No impact on their driving. Maybe because they're more likely to have the electric vehicles that we talked about. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead now and move to this issue of zero emissions vehicles, which are largely the electric vehicles, but also dealing with the hydrogen fuel cell. I mean, there are several different kinds. Actually, the poll question itself had the definition that California uses of zero emissions vehicles, and I'll give you a little bit of inside baseball, folks. When Donald Bryson, the president of the Locke Foundation, who is the main person in charge of putting together this poll, when he was talking about these issues, he wanted to find zero emissions vehicles because that's the language that Governor Cooper used in his executive order that we'll be talking about. And he said, well, does that mean just electric vehicles? He found a nice substantial definition from California that includes not just electric vehicles, but all of the others. This is my favorite slide in the deck because there's almost universal agreement here. How many people are driving zero emissions vehicles now? 3% yes, 96% no. And if you look at the various categories, it's pretty universal.
One's driving. Let's be real. No one's driving them.
It's pretty universal. No one. Highest rates of driving them, 5% in the central part of the state, and 5% among people making $70,000 to $100,000 a year. Interestingly enough, higher among that group than people making more than $100,000. I guess they figure we've got money to spend. We're not worried about it.
And young people, the 18 to 34 category.
Yeah, exactly. 7%. Yeah, that's very interesting. That especially given the fact that zero emission vehicles tend to be more expensive. The fact that 18 to 34-year-olds are deciding to spend a substantial chunk of their, what you would presume to be lesser salary on this.
Now, in theory, a higher upfront cost for lesser maintenance costs and fuel costs later, in theory.
All right, and the next question that we had on this same topic was, are you likely to buy a zero emissions vehicle with your next purchase? And I think part of the thinking of this was, we're dealing with higher gas prices now. 96% of people aren't driving these types of vehicles, but are the higher gas prices, the concern maybe about the climate, are they going to drive people toward this? 13% say yes, but 66% say no, and 21% unsure.
And again, across the board, nobody, not the liberals, not the unaffiliated, not the Democrats. No one's going to, no one group is planning to do this. But it's not surprising. My producer that I work with at WBTV did some quick Googling a couple weeks ago when a story surrounding EVs popped up in the Charlotte area. You can almost not find one. It is prohibitively hard and prohibitively expensive to find an EV in North Carolina. Now, I expect that'll start to change. Ford's made an electric F-150. Toyota's rolling out all these electric vehicles. Jeep, I was talking with a buddy today, is making an electric version of a Cherokee or Cherokee-like, Grand Cherokee-like thing. I think we'll start to get to that point where people realize, oh, maybe I can buy an electric vehicle. We're not there yet, and even if you wanted one, it's very hard and very expensive to get one. And so I think that explains these numbers.
I think you have sort of a chicken and egg conundrum. I work for a free market think tank, and the idea is let the market decide. As the gas prices go up, more and more people are going to be interested in these alternatives, which will bring in entrepreneurs who will come up with these other ideas. But then other folks will say, look, this is an incredibly hard market to break into. There need to be subsidies. There need to be things done that would sway people in this direction, at least while it's an infant industry.
And let's not forget, had we asked this question 5 years ago, that yes number would have been like 3%.
Right, probably the same number that we saw on the slide before, and it would have been the
right.
same breakdown. All right, one of the reasons that this came about was because of an executive order that Governor Roy Cooper issued that dealt with this idea of trying to put more zero emissions vehicles on the roads. And we asked about that order and what people thought about it. 39% supported it, 44% opposed it. Very interesting that even though people they don't own these vehicles now, only 13% say they're probably going to buy one with their next car. Still, well over a third, close to 40%, say they like the governor taking this action.
I'm actually more shocked at the opposition here. I mean, and look, it's just the most mild, I think, opinions that we've seen in this poll. It doesn't really affect anyone's day-to-day, but you could see this maybe as overreach potentially. I think it makes sense if you support it that, look, this is a goal. Goals are good. Why not? It doesn't affect me necessarily. So all that being said, I'm surprised we see such a high number of opposed.
And if you look at the subgroups among liberals, 84% to 8%. So this is, just as you were alluding to, this is a goal. This is something we need to move toward. It's a great idea. Also among the younger voters, 18 to 34, 52% of them like the order, 29% don't. Republicans and conservatives, 3-1.
We'll put them down as a maybe, I guess.
3-1 against. So not quite as opposed as they are on some other things. I mean,
yeah.
We saw on one that Republicans were 99% united in one way. They're not as united.
We'll attribute that, again, had you asked this 5 years ago, I bet that would have been at the 99% level. I think this, again, is showing the shift and the change is starting to come. On this particular issue, the change is being led by liberals, but we see Republicans and conservatives are also moving in that direction, maybe more slowly.
So that was the last main question from the poll. I do have one that has been submitted to us via Facebook, and we'll get to that. And I will tell you that we'll have a couple more minutes if you'd like to type away at facebook.com/John Locke Foundation. Nick will have a chance to join me in answering your questions. This is one, and I think both of, unless you have the answer, I'm guessing we're both going to have to punt. But we have a question from Chelsea asking, if they have their voting rights back, would that mean they can run for public office, talking about the felons voting?
They can.
They can if they're registered to vote?
I know this because I live in Charlotte, where Patrick Cannon, former mayor of the city of Charlotte, who's a convicted felon for accepting bribes while in office, has filed to run for city council at large again. And so, yes, once you file your restoration of rights, and you have to go and get that filed and approved by the clerk of court, and you register to run for election again, you can be an elected official in North Carolina.
Very interesting. Now, I know that there has been discussion, at least in some offices, of banning that. You'll remember the old Gerald Heggie case, where laws have been passed in the General Assembly that would block any felon from running for sheriff.
Right.
I don't know if that would apply for any other position.
Didn't that get thrown out?
I believe it may have.
I think it actually got thrown out.
So I don't want to definitively say that for every office.
Yes,
could,
but at least for some.
Yes, at least for some.
Well, and actually, let's go back, if I may, to the Vote Collectors.
Yes.
The main character, McCrae Dallas, he is a convicted felon from
which is his
fraud.
book, The Vote Collectors. You can find it wherever you buy books, co-authored by our guest, Nick Oxner.
So McCrae Dallas, one of the main character in the book, is a convicted felon from insurance fraud in the 80s, but he held unelected office on the Soil and Water Conservation Board. He had his rights restored. He votes. He holds political office. That's just an example. Again, Patrick Cannon running, and a favored candidate, I think, to win re-election back to the city council in Charlotte.
Now, I'm guessing in both of those cases, I'm not sure with Cannon, but I think so with McCrae Dallas, they had the rights restored under the law, which
Correct.
is the law that was thrown out. So Chelsea's question, I'm not exactly sure what would happen, because just to recap, the state constitution says felons cannot vote unless they get their rights restored as established by law. We've had a law on the books for many, many years. The current law was on the books since 1973. The court that threw out the law then basically said felons who have completed active prison time can register to vote. One of the complaints has been, wait a minute, if you threw out the law, basically felons can't vote because the Constitution says they can't vote unless they followed the law.
You're making my head hurt.
Yeah, so this is very complicated. I think this would probably depend, the answer to Chelsea's question will probably depend on how the case is ultimately decided.
I agree with that.
If the state Supreme Court decides not just to throw out the law, but that felons who have completed active prison time should be registered to vote or should be allowed to register to vote, my guess is that would probably pave the way to them also being able to run for office. Yeah. Though I would not say that, I would not bet money on it. I would say that'd be very likely.
And and taking it at the basic question though, if you can vote, can you run for office? Generally speaking, I think that answer would be yes.
Yes, yes. Certainly under the current law as it has stood, once you have followed the existing law to get your rights restored, yes, then you can run for office again.
Notwithstanding all of that caveat.
Yes, notwithstanding all of that. Now, with the current situation of those who have finished their active prison time but have not completed their sentence, if they get to be allowed to register to vote, will they also be able to run for office? That, I think, is an unresolved question, but probably will be resolved by the state Supreme Court. All right, well, I don't have any other questions. Actually, Chelsea has chimed in again. From my understanding, in order to file for office, you must be able to vote in that particular election, which is basically what you said. No other questions at this point coming in via Facebook, so we are getting close to the top of the hour. I will give you one more opportunity, Nick, to give your general impression of this poll. Anything that really leaped out at you?
No, I think the highlights are Democrats have some real problems in the midterm elections, unless your name's Roy Cooper. And so it'll be interesting if I'm a legislative Democrat in North Carolina to see how many ads Roy Cooper pops up in for legislative Democrats. We'll see. He's the most popular Democrat. Well, we didn't poll, Beth Wood and some of the others, and Josh Stein. I would have loved to see a Cooper comparison versus a Josh Stein approval rating. But I have to imagine he's probably the most popular Democrat in North Carolina, statewide at least. And so, is any of this surprising given where we are with the economy, given where Joe Biden's approval numbers are? No. Or is the Biden approval numbers in this poll out of line? Is it an outlier from what we know nationally? No. And so they've got an uphill battle to climb. I'm hearing that around Raleigh and around the state. And they know that. Democrats know that and are girding for that, I think. And we'll see how that plays out. There's a long time, though, between now and November.
interesting follow-up on something that you mentioned. I was just on an interview, on a television interview with Tom Jensen, the pollster, who made one of your exact same points, that legislative Democrats might be looking to tie themselves to Cooper, because the recent poll that came out that Spectrum News was involved in put his approval at something like 58%. So he was much higher on that poll. It'll be interesting to see. Think any members of, or people running for Congress will want to tie themselves to Cooper, even though he has nothing to do with what's going on in D.C.
You know, I heard a Pat McCrory ad on the radio, I think, the other day that tried to tie Ted Budd to Joe Biden. So
there you go. There you go.
So you could, just as a reminder, that political consultants can try to tie anybody to anybody else as long as their unfavorables are high enough.
Exactly true. All right. Well, before we wrap up, we mentioned it at the beginning of the hour, but one more opportunity for people who are interested in all of these political issues, the shenanigans that went on with that famous, or I guess infamous, 9th Congressional District race back in 2018. Tell us about your chronicle of all of those details.
Yes, and so, you know, in The Vote Collectors, the book that I co-wrote with Michael Graff, you know, we use the 2018 shenanigans and the scandal that led to a congressional race being thrown out. The subtitle, which is so long I don't remember it all the time, it calls it the nation's greatest electoral fraud. And people say, why is it the greatest? And we say, because it's the only one that we know about in modern American history. And so it really starts there, but asks, how did we get to that point? And then we tell you about the crazy characters all the way along the way.
And the book is titled The Vote Collectors. His name is Nick Ochsner. You spell it with a K, N-I-C-K. Last name O-C-H-S-N-E-R. You can follow him on Twitter at Nick Ochsner WBTV. That's because he's the chief investigative reporter at WBT. Nick, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we thank you for joining us for this latest Civitas poll presentation. I will note, because this is very important, the next time that the Civitas poll is released, you'll have a chance to join us once again in person. Those of you who have followed the Civitas poll over the years remember that it has typically over the years involved a poll luncheon taking place with people getting together, having a chance to talk about the poll results among themselves. That's going to be returning. One of the other good signs that COVID is, if not behind us, certainly much less of an issue than it was back in March of 2020. So in May, the Civitas poll presentation will be back live and in person. If you want to watch online, you still can, but you can also join us in person, and we look forward to seeing you then. My name, once again, is Mitch Kokai. You've been watching this Civitas poll presentation on behalf of the John Lott Foundation.